It is good to be in the house of the Lord this morning. Bear with me a little bit this morning. I've caught the cold that Sarah passed to Ned and Ned passed on to me. So if I start coughing or anything, just give me a moment, I'll come back at it. Now, pretty much all of you know that your pastor is pretty much a geek. And this is a geek weekend, so I'm going to work a few things into the sermon that are going to allow me to use a few quotes from Star Wars, considering this is a Star Wars holiday weekend. Thursday was 501st Day. Today is May the 4th, which is recognized as International Star Wars Day. May the 4th be with you. So, that being said, I'm starting in Hebrews chapter 11 this morning. And starting at verse 1. Now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen, for by it the men of old gained approval. One thing that is part and parcel to our Christian life is faith. Without faith, we don't really have a Christian life. Now, if we want to further that, we can look at James, and James tells us that faith without works is dead. But I'm not going that route this morning. I'm wanting to focus more on faith. We need it. We have to have it. It's something that is essential and vital to our Christian lives. So essential that I will flip to James for just a second, but it's not going to be to quote the faith without works. It is James chapter 1 and verse 3. Consider it all joy, my brethren. Oh, sorry, wrong verse. Knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Now, when we go through trials, it brings about faith, and that faith then, as we're tested, brings about endurance. When we first start out in our Christian life, we may not have the largest measure of faith, but it's something that we continue to build on as we go through our life. James would, as we continue on, give us a few building blocks that once we have that faith, it builds endurance, and then endurance goes on in its perfect result so that we may be perfect and complete. Well, faith is that first thing that we have to have if we want to be able to be at some point perfect. That makes faith something that gives great possibilities away. Just stop and think about that. Jesus tells us that no man is perfect. Yet, we're being told that through faith we may become perfect. Now, that means that in this next life, we will finally see perfection. But through faith, we're going to get there. Through enduring what this world throws at us, heaps upon us. Matthew chapter 17, verse 20. Now, give a little bit of preface so that I'm not taking this out of context. You understand what the context is that we're looking at. This verse is coming right after the disciples have been trying to cast the demons out of a person that is possessed. And they're asking Jesus, why could we not do this? And he chides them a little bit for their lack of faith. And he said to them, because of your littleness of faith, For truly I say to you, if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, move from here, and it will move, and nothing will be impossible to you. Now, here's where I'm going to insert one of those Star Wars quotes. Darth Vader says, I find your lack of faith disturbing. Jesus says it's because of your littleness of faith that this didn't happen. You know, sometimes we go through things and we put forth this effort that we just call it, we're trying. We don't really go at it wholeheartedly. One of the things that I always love to point out in this aspect is we as humans set human limitations upon ourselves. We limit ourselves in ways that we say this is what we can do, and that's really as much as we're able to give. In Sunday school this morning we were talking about facing the giants. And that's always one of my favorite references in that point is the death crawl, where the coach has the boy carry the other one across the field on his knees. And he's like, well, I can only go so far. It's like, all right, then let's do it blindfolded. And he keeps encouraging him until he's all the way in the end zone. The boy didn't even think he could go to the halfway mark. We set these limits upon ourselves, and part of it's because of our lack of faith in ourselves. One thing we should always understand, if God has set something for us, we need to have the faith to understand it's something that we are capable of doing. God's not going to ask me to do something I cannot do. God's not going to ask you to do something you cannot do, not without His help. So when Jesus is illustrating, if you have faith even the size of a mustard seed, you can say to this mountain, be gone, and it will be gone. In Luke, he also makes reference to, if you tell this mulberry tree to be cast away, it'll be uprooted and cast away. In other words, God's saying, if you have enough faith in Him, and you're trusting in Him, He's going to make things move in your life. Now, I take this a little bit more in a metaphorical sense, because Jesus was very used to teaching in parables so that people could understand things. Now, I'm not going to say that we are going to have faith and be a master of the force and literally pick up and move a physical mountain. We're not going to go to the Smokies and say, let's rearrange the Smokies. Yeah. However, we have a turn of phrase that we love to make mountains out of molehills. We have problems come up in our lives, and rather than allowing those problems to be something that we move out of the way and go on through, we take this little problem and we build it up and make it into something bigger. With faith, God will help us move those mountains in our lives. Great things are possible when we have faith. Now, I'm not going to ever give a message that's completely sugar-coated and say that everything in our life is going to be peachy keen. That everything in our life is always going to work out. There will be hard times, there will be trials. Reference back to James chapter 1, verse 3. Those trials bring about our faith, which brings about endurance, which brings about the perfect result. Now, the thing is, we continue to have faith through those so that we may be made perfect. And that's where these mountains and molehills come in. And then in Matthew 14, to 33. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side, while he sent the crowds away. After he had sent the crowds away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray, and when it was evening, He was there alone, but the boat was already a long distance from the land, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. And in the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid." Peter said to him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." And Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But seeing the wind, he became frightened, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand, took hold of him, and said to him, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" When he got into the boat, the wind stopped, and those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, "You certainly are God's Son." Now Jesus chides Peter for being of little faith, or letting his faith fail him at this point. It's a terrifying time. One of the things I love to point out to us in modern society is why we don't really address this in the same awe and reverence that they would have in the world that this was wrote. We as a modern society are kind of jaded to some of these things. We're used to watching TV and cinema and all these special effects. So seeing something or somebody walking on the water isn't necessarily as awe-inspiring to us. The fact that they said he was a ghost implies that he was glowing. Probably as he was after coming off the Mount of Transfiguration, because he'd been spending time in prayer. Otherwise, again, this is fourth watch of the night. It's the darkest time of the night. It's stormy, so there's obviously not any light coming in from the moon. They have to see him somehow. We're going to draw from the Mount of Transfiguration that is glowing there and say that he was probably glowing. Thus, the reason they say he's a ghost. So they're all scared. Jesus calls out to them and calms them and says, "No, it's just me. Be calm." Peter, being Peter, gotta love Peter. He always wanted to just hop in and do things. He didn't really think about things a lot beforehand. He's always ready to jump to it. He's, "Lord, if it's really you, tell me to come out there on the water too." I can't really help but think there was a childlike excitement in him at that prospect. And Jesus says, "Sure, come on out." Peter hops out onto the water. Now, here's where it goes a step further. Not just are you seeing a person walking on the water, but as Peter, you hopped out of the boat. You're standing in the waves, not sinking. I'm sure that at first that elation is really high, and Peter's like, "I'm doing something that can't be done." Then the wind, the waves, reality. Growing up, we've all seen the Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote. Roadrunner runs off the cliff and he keeps running, and all of a sudden he looks down and realizes he's running in midair, and then he falls. That's kind of what happens with Peter. He's all excited. Then his brain clicks. He's like, "Wait a minute. This is water. I should be sinking. My goodness, look at the waves. The wind. I'm going to drown. This is a terrible storm." And he takes his eyes off of Jesus, and he lets his faith falter. He allows these things to sink in that he hadn't thought of. These little things to pick at him and pull him apart. And he begins to sink. But Jesus is still there with him, lifts him up out of the waves, takes him back to the boat and chides him on his faith. Now, many people, many a time, has giving Peter a hard time because Jesus says, "Ye of little faith." How much more faith, though, did he have than the rest of them sitting in the boat? When Jesus says, "Come on, hop out," the rest of them are all sitting there, "No, I don't think I'm going to do that." "You go ahead, we'll see what happens." And Peter just takes off. Sometimes we actually start that way into things in our Christian life. We're called to do something. We jump in headlong without giving a moment's thought. Then problems, we're like, "Well, I can't really do it because of this. I can't do it because of that. I didn't really think of that." But if God calls us to do it, we can do it.
Amen.
But then that comes back to, we oftentimes limit ourselves on try. Try is a word that I really do not like. The reason I say that is oftentimes when a person says, "I tried my best," or "I'm going to try to do this." First off, when somebody says they tried their best, they didn't really give everything that they felt they had. They did the amount that they felt appropriate, because it didn't work, they were done. When a person often says, "I'm going to try this," there's much doubt in them that they're going to be able to accomplish it. In other words, you're not going to say, "I'm going to try." You're going to say, "I'm going to do." If you have faith you can do it, it's not, "I'll try," it's, "I'll do it."
Right.
So let's throw another Star Wars quote out there. Master Yoda says, "There is no try, there is do or do not." But we limit ourselves with that word try. We use it as an excuse to cover that we don't really think we can, but we'll go through the motions so that maybe people won't feel bad at us. That we don't think we can do it, but because God said we should do this, we're going to try to do this. Now, back at Hebrews 11, it addresses that great cloud of witnesses that we are in. It's the chapter that we started off in, so it's only fitting it'll be the chapter we finish up in. We have such a great cloud of witnesses when we look at the Old Testament saints that it addresses. And those Old Testament saints, the writer of Hebrews attributes these great things that they did to their faith. Talks about Enoch and how Enoch walked with God in faith. And that his faith was so strong in God that his body was not found. He was caught up into heaven. He is one of two instances that we have in the Bible of a person whose faith was so strong that they didn't taste the mortal death. We have Enoch and we have Elijah. Faith. Abraham had his faith credited to him as righteousness. Abraham's faith in God and to do what God called him to do was so strong that God counted that faith as righteousness. And because of that, made a promise. We often refer to that as the Abrahamic covenant, where God creates a covenant with Abraham, yet it's not so much conditional on Abraham. Abraham's already completed his condition to it. He had this faith. Abraham's faith was so great that God called him to give his son as a sacrifice. You know, we can possibly see some foreshadowing here God's calling Abraham to make the same sacrifice that God knows he's going to be making. Abraham is willing to make that sacrifice when God calls him to. Now, I've heard all kinds of different views on that. Some say that it's Abraham's faith was so strong that he knew that if God was asking him to offer up his son, that God would replace his son. However, the thing is, he had so much faith in God and what God was asking him to do that he was willing to part with something he loved so dearly. Now, all of us that are parents think we love our children. But let's stop and look at Abraham. He's an old man, far from being a spring chicken. He didn't have Isaac until late in his life, at a point that all of us would be considered beyond child-rearing years. Yet, here he is, willing to offer up this son, and by human standards, odds are his wife will not be able to bear him another son. But he's willing to offer him up because he has faith in what God has asked him to do. Talks about Joseph and how by faith he rose through the ranks in Pharaoh's household, became an advisor, and by his faith ended up saving his family. Talks about Moses, who was hidden for his first 3 months while he was alive, by faith. Because at this point in time, the Egyptians were really disliking the Hebrews, and they were killing them out. Many of the children were just being slaughtered. But instead of being slaughtered, he was hidden, put in a basket, floated down the river. Pharaoh's daughter finds him, takes him in, and by faith his mother ends up being his nursemaid. Through faith, God accomplishes great and wonderful things. Now, faith means at times us doing things that just seem ridiculous. Because again, in the great heroes of faith, it talks about Joshua and the walls of Jericho. Now, who of you is going to be willing to accept that if I march around this city for 7 days, playing instruments and singing, and then march around it 7 times for the 7th day, the walls are going to come tumbling down? Most of us in here have been involved in the construction industry at some point. We understand how strong that brick and mortar wall is. There's going to be some doubt that creeps in that, I know how strong that brick and mortar is. I can walk up and smack that with a sledgehammer, and it's not really going to do too much to that brick and mortar wall. I can keep pounding and pounding and pounding. I've been walking around it for 7 times. Great faith. And in the midst of that faith, when you're doing this thing that seems totally fantastical, of course, the people on the other side of the wall are laughing at you and thinking you're crazy. Well, they're expecting you to attack it. Well, you're just walking around playing instruments, playing music. Are you going to serenade me to death? But Joshua, this great hero of faith, continues to have faith and march around the walls. God brings them down through faith. When God calls us to do something, sometimes it's going to seem crazy to us. Do you think Noah really thought it was a normal idea? Let's build a boat in the middle of the wilderness, nowhere near a body of water. It pretty much flat out tells us that the people around him made fun of him and thought he was crazy. Be like one of us here on Wells Hill all of a sudden deciding to build a huge boat. What is the community gonna say? But through it all, Noah had faith and he continued on.
Amen.
And through his faith, humanity was saved. Because had Noah not had the faith and done as God said, Noah would have died with everybody else in the flood. Then it mentions several of the judges. Gideon. Gideon again is one of those that we look at Gideon's 300, and I always love to compare it to the 300 Spartans. See, when Gideon is taken and told to choose these men, he's basically given an option. Now, you've got to remember, when Gideon's found, he's threshing wheat down in a wine press. Scared that the Midianites are going to find him and take the stuff away from him, he's scared. When he's told that he's going to do this, he's like, well, I can't. I'm the least of the least of the least. He's the least member of the least family of the least tribe. How can he do anything? He's nobody. Then essentially, the troops that he's given, as they're narrowed down, are the troops that are just as afraid as he is, if not more so. They're not skilled soldiers. Yet they rout an army of 300,000. Now, the reason I compare that to the 300 Spartans. The Spartans were a warrior society. If you were born with any defects, you were killed. You did not live. From the point of birth, you were raised as a warrior. They lived by the motto that you either came home with your shield or on your shield. In other words, you came home with victory or with death. You fought. They were the most highly skilled soldiers in the ancient world. 300 of those held off a huge invading force, but were all killed. In stark contrast to Gideon's scared, terrified, untrained 300, who all survived through faith. But it's through that faith that great things can work through us, with us, and for us.
Amen.
We need to cling to faith. Life is going to throw problems at us. It's going to give us troubles. There will be hard times. But through faith, we can survive through it. And the best thing to consider, if for some reason we don't survive in this physical life, through faith we will know where we will be. Where that next life is. Now that's all I really have to say for this morning.